Okay, hi there. In this video, we're going to spend a few minutes thinking about the economics of a carbon border tax. Now, a carbon border tax is a levy or a tariff that aims to reduce emissions. It does so by placing a tariff on imports from countries that have less stringent climate policies. And the basic aim is to try to level the playing field for domestic manufacturing businesses that are already subject to carbon pricing, for example, carbon trading. The aim is to prevent foreign companies from gaining a cost advantage because they're exporting products from a country with lower environmental regulations, for example. So they will be required to pay a fee for the carbon emissions embedded in their products, the ones that they're exporting. And the European Union, the EU, is developing a carbon border tax mechanism, CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is going to levy a carbon tax on imports of selected energy products coming into the EU from 2023. Here's the announcement published here in the Financial Times. The EU's pioneering carbon border tax. Now, we know that external costs damage third parties. You will have covered market failure and externalities in your Year 12 economics course. But external costs, of course, sometimes the consumer and the producer don't have to pay, meaning the market output is too high. So in this diagram here, if we don't take into account the externalities, we end up at output Q1 instead of Q2, which is the social optimum. In the case of negative externalities, including products which generate carbon emissions, the market price tends to be too low in the absence of government intervention. So one of the options, of course, if there's a social welfare loss from overproduction, is to introduce a carbon tax. And here's an example of how you can show this on a market failure diagram. Of course, the tax adds to the marginal private cost of production, helps to internalize the externality, drives the price up, causing a contraction along the demand curve to output Q2. And of course, that can then lead to tax revenues, which could be used to fund, for example, low carbon or green investment. So a carbon border tax, is all part of the environmental strategy of a country, but it also, of course, connects to international trade. There's the tax revenue, by the way, from introducing a pollution tax. And of course, you're internalising the externality and driving the price up better to reflect the external costs of production. Well, what about the European carbon border tax? What about three advantages and justifications? How might we argue in favour of a carbon border tax? Well, on the one hand, it is designed to encourage countries that have weaker, perhaps slightly laxer environmental policies to take action to reduce their CO2 emissions. So they're really trying to encourage, for example, non-EU countries to embrace cleaner production in industries such as iron and steel or cement making or aluminium or even things like fertilizers for farming. Secondly, of course, it is a form of protectionism in a sense. It's a carbon border tax. It's a tax on imports. So this is designed in a way to prevent leakage, emissions leakage. So basically, emissions leakage is when production, businesses, transnational corporations move their manufacturing to countries with weaker client policies, to countries where there's less stringent rules for emissions. Of course, you end up with a loss of jobs and you end up with higher pollution as a result. So this is designed to try and combat that. And thirdly, of course, most taxes generate revenue. So-called green tariffs can generate revenue for climate action, so they could be used to fund investment in renewable energy and energy efficiency. The European Union Commission predicts that the new carbon border tax could produce somewhere between half to maybe €1 billion of tax revenues for the European Union from 2023 onwards. But of course, if you're evaluating, you want to think about some of the downsides, the drawbacks, or the limitations of a carbon border tax. On the one hand, countries like China, Australia, Turkey, India, they could be affected by these, and they might regard the carbon border tax as a form of trade protectionism. So that could lead to trade disputes, which ultimately, of course, could bring down the growth of trade between the European Union and other key countries. And a fall in exports initially, certainly in the short term, if you think about fertilizers or if you think about textiles from from certain countries, that could hamper growth and poverty reduction in poorer countries. Second drawback is that the carbon border tax would, of course, increase the cost of imported goods, which could then lead to higher consumer prices. And this would have a regressive impact, presumably, on lower income households. I guess the third point is it's just one option amongst many, this carbon border tax. In theory, it would be better if there was greater multinational agreement. Some economists argue, for example, we should have a carbon price which is global, essentially. How many? I know, 75 euros per tonne of CO2. If countries could agree for all companies to have a carbon tax produced as a result of their emissions, that might be just simpler, more effective. But of course, agreement on this is a long way off. Most countries still have their own climate change policies. So the idea to impose additional costs on high carbon imports is known as a Green Tariff, a carbon border tax. Now, some people think this is a good way of protecting jobs in high-income countries, in steel, in aluminium production, etc. Others regard it as an important part of the process of levelling the playing field and encouraging climate action in countries like India, where perhaps there are less stringent environmental rules. But we're going to have to wait and see what happens. The European Union is the first major region to introduce it. The United States and Canada also thinking of something similar. So a carbon border tax will be an important trade policy with environmental aims and credentials that is definitely worth keeping an eye on in the weeks, the months and the years to come. Thanks for watching. Take care. Stay safe. Stay happy. See you soon.